Thank you.
You're the first one that got an applause to start with.
I'm telling you. Let me tell you a story here about 1999. Whenever I applied for a job at Wells High School, they had advertised for a position. It was the middle of the year, and the position advertised for that I saw said U.S. history teacher. And I was fully prepared to be a U.S. history teacher, and I went up there and I did my interview with Mr. Morton and the campus principal at the time, and I got that job, and I went home and told my wife that I had been hired to be the new U.S. history teacher at Wells, and then I showed up on the Monday before getting kids on Tuesday and discovered that I was the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade history teacher. So for your own sake, I want you to know that I'm fully prepared that when this is over with, I'm going to be cleaning up everything. I'm sure Dale has something else for me to do. That having been said, that was 20 years ago, and it started the best 20 years of my life. Thank you. Mr. Morton is not only my boss the last 20 years, but one of my closest friends there that I work with. And I spent many a morning sitting there talking with him about the trials and tribulations. When I wrote this particular lesson, and again, I'm not a theologian, I'm a history teacher and a professor, but I am a believer. When I wrote this lesson, I wrote it originally for a student presentation for a Christians in Action group, and then I was called on to do it at a couple of other churches, and I find that every time I get called on to do this, the world somehow bends and it fits in it. And I call this Washington, a man of duty and destiny. And if you watch the news today, we need men of duty and men of destiny more than we ever have. We have people out there that are actively working to tear down our nation. We have people out there that believe that we are not one nation under God anymore and don't want us to be. And those revisionists have gone so far as redefining our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. Washington, though, in particular, as deists and not Christians. That makes me mad. Makes me angry. Because a deist is someone that believes that God created the world, but like a great clockmaker, he wound that clock up and then he just let it run. He didn't come back and check on it later. He didn't interfere in our daily lives. Washington was anything but a deist. Washington believed that God moved in each of our lives every day. You can go back and do a Google Ngram search. I had to get my son to show me how to do that because I'm not that bright when it comes to technology. You can go on there and search words, and no president spoke of God more than George Washington. The only one that was close was John Adams, our first and second president. This is not a deist. This is a Christian. So I'm going to take us through a little bit of George Washington's life here. George Washington, at the age of 19, applied to be an officer in the British military. That was his one great dream. 19 years old, he applied, and he was turned down. He was turned down to be an officer in the British Army because they said that he was not equipped enough, nor did he have the intellectual facility to serve in the British Army. By the way, the person that signed the document that turned George Washington down for that commission was one General Cornwallis. If you know your history, that's the general that Washington defeats at Yorktown. So instead of going in the British Army, at 19 years old, he went in the Virginia militia. And he is called upon to go out and secure this land out west. 19 years old. They sent him with 12 men. And he goes out to the forks of the Ohio River with the orders from Governor Dinwiddie to build a fort because this land was claimed by France and it was claimed by England. Build a fort and protect this land from France. He has 12 men with him. And he shows up out there and he goes to the mouth of the Ohio River. If anybody here is an NFL fan, where this is where Three Rivers meet, and that might sound familiar to you. Three Rivers Stadium stood there for years and years and years. But he goes out there and he starts to build a fort. And then the French showed up with 300 men. And they chased Washington off, and they built a big fort, and they named it Fort Duquesne. Washington doesn't give up. He goes back, he gets reinforcements. They promoted him. He's not a major anymore, he's a lieutenant colonel at 19, 20 years old by now. The problem must have been that he didn't have enough rank. So they promoted him. Shows up as a lieutenant colonel. Now he has 35 men. And Washington with 35 men come up there and they knock on that door of the fort. Get off our land. There's 300 Frenchmen in this, and Washington's got the nerve to do this. He wasn't successful at this. He was pushed away. He goes back and he has to build a fort himself. Y'all have all heard the story of Fort Necessity. I always tell my students, when you think about Fort Necessity, I don't want you to think of a fort like you see in the cowboy and Indian movies. This fort is more like the ones my son built in the woods when he was 6, okay? It's stacking up wood and hiding behind it. And with his 35 men, he managed to hold off this force. Now, in the end, Washington doesn't take this fort. They have to bring some more men in. They do eventually take it. They rename it Fort Pitt, and it's where Pittsburgh is today. But Washington, when the odds are against him, he still stands. And he believes God is on his side. Let's go a few years later, 1755, at the Battle of Monongahela. It bothers me that the Battle of Monongahela is not a battle that we all know anymore. It used to be. It used to be a battle we all know. If you go ask your parents or your grandparents about the Battle of Monongahela, they can probably tell you about it. General Braddock has Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Washington, and a group of men, Virginia militiamen, assigned to him. And they're out marching to try and remove the French. This is the French and Indian War now, which, by the way, really should have been called World War I, in case you're at all curious. This was fought on 4 continents. But our side of it, the French and Indian War. And they show up there, and Braddock has his men in their pretty red coats with their brass buttons, and they're marching in line with drums and fife corps. And Washington tells them, you can't fight a war like that here. If you fight a war like that here, we'll all die. The French and the Indian are going to fight Indian-style warfare. They're going to fight with guerrilla warfare. We don't have kids here, so I don't have to make my bad joke here, but I always tell them this is guerrilla, G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A, not gorilla. Guerrilla warfare is where you climb up in trees and throw coconuts at each other. Guerrilla warfare is where you hide behind things and shoot at each other, okay? Well, Washington is ignored by Braddock. Braddock says, no, I'm not listening to this simple Virginian that was turned down for a commission, and his men marched in. And as they're crossing this river, it's called Blood River today. That's what the Indians called it after this, because British blood flowed so much in it, it was stained red. They're crossing the river, and the French and their Indian allies hiding in trees begin firing. And the British, in chaos, begin firing back. Smoke is everywhere. I want you to imagine this. You're in this water trying to cross, water up to your waist or higher, and there's smoke everywhere. You can't see in front of you, and you're getting shot at by these people. When it's over with, George Washington is the only British officer left unhurt. At the end of it, there's 1,000 British dead and only 40 French dead. You can't tell me Washington wasn't selected here by God to survive this. In fact, there's a story told by Dr. Benjamin Church. Benjamin Church was he was a Presbyterian minister. He was a surgeon of sorts. He was really a barber, but he was a surgeon for the American Revolution. And he tells the story over and over again of years later, he and Washington go back to this spot, and they brought a bunch of their officers with them because they were paid in land. We didn't have any money. So they went out there, and Washington, being the surveyor, he wanted to make sure they got good farmland. He didn't want swampland. Well, they were out there, and Benjamin Church says that this Indian came up to him. And this Indian said, "Town taker." That's what the Indians called Washington, was town taker. Said, "Town taker, I was at that battle. I was commanding French troops, and I ordered my men, everybody, to fire at you. And I love this quote. He said, "Our guns that could not miss could not hit you." And he says, "This man cannot be killed. This man was selected by God." And he wanted to meet that man that was selected by God. This is his former enemy that is now saying, "I saw it. God chose this man. This is a man of destiny." By the way, there's no evidence that Washington himself ever told this story. Dr. Church, however, told everybody this story. This story was repeated over and over again. This is a man of duty. By the way, if you want to tell me that this is a man that doesn't believe in God, on his way out, we know from diaries that he took the officers with him. And we hear the story of him giving Braddock a Christian-style burial, his own general. The man who had ignored him gave him a Christian-style burial while reading from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. This is not something a deist does. This is something a Christian does. Let's go a couple years later. The American Revolution, 1777. The Battle of Valley Forge. We all know the Battle of Valley Forge. It was a horrible winter. The Americans were unprepared. In fact, there's a story that Washington wrote, there's a letter from him, where Washington said, "I look around me and I see that I'm surrounded by the incredibly young, the incredibly old, and the incredibly sick." This is what we had at Valley Forge. There should be no way we win this battle. But Washington daily went out in prayer. There's a great painting of it that was done years later of Washington on his knees in the snow with his horseback behind him. How do we know about this? Because Washington wasn't he didn't pray on the street corners loudly for everybody to hear. He prayed privately. And in this case, Washington had gone out in the woods by himself, dropped on his knees, and was praying for his men. A Quaker minister stumbled across him. Now, if you know anything about the Quakers are devoutly religious people, but they're pacifists. They don't believe in fighting. They take turn the other cheek incredibly literally. This Quaker minister stumbled across Washington there on his knees praying. And he writes himself later on that while I am a Quaker and I do not believe in this fighting, clearly I'm supposed to follow this man of God. And this Quaker joined the army. There's something moving there. There's something moving there. And by the way, at Valley Forge, Washington manages to hold his army together. I know we always teach us a great victory. Washington it wasn't really a great victory, but Washington, outnumbered, held his army together, where a defeat at Valley Forge would have meant a defeat of everything. The army would have completely collapsed. A few years later, at the end of the war, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, Washington against Cornwallis, the same man who had turned him down for this commission years earlier. Cornwallis, who had never lost a battle, by the way. Washington pulls a kind of a stunt on him. We call it a recon pull in the Marine Corps, where he faked a retreat, and the British followed him. He pulls out here on this peninsula, makes a quick J-turn, and traps the British on the peninsula. The French showed up just in time to shut off any way for the English to escape by sea. Washington manages to win this great victory at Yorktown. But there's a story about it. Right as the battle goes to fire, the British fired, and they said a cannonball landed right at Washington's feet. Dirt flew up, people are dying all around. Washington's horse got knocked over, and when they got through, Washington stood up, brushed the dust off of himself, and said, "Let's go, boys." And the attack began. This is the man that had 4 horses shot out from underneath him at one point. This is the man that has now survived a cannonball with a near hit. And at the end of the Battle of Yorktown, there's a quote from Washington. He said, "No people can be bound to knowledge and ignore the invisible hand that conducts the affairs of man more than the people of the United States." That is not the words of a deist. That's the words of a Christian. By the way, I'm going to take a little offshoot here because I like this story. At the end of Battle of Yorktown, there's a great story about what happened. It may be true, it may not be true, but it's a great story. Washington, according to legend, and the first part's true. I'll tell you when we get to the part that may or may not be true. Washington goes out to accept the surrender of Cornwallis. And Cornwallis, being the proud man that he is, refuses to be the person to give his sword up. That's the way you used to surrender. You would offer your officer's sword up. So Washington finds a lieutenant, and he says, "You do it." I'm sorry, Cornwallis finds the lieutenant and says, "You do it. You go surrender to the redneck." Okay? This part we know is true. And the lieutenant showed up, and Washington, not being a proud man, went out to accept the sword. But Alexander Hamilton was there. And Hamilton was a proud man. He was also the aide-de-camp to Washington. He says, "No, sir. No, sir. This is not appropriate. You're a general. You can't accept the surrender from a lieutenant. Let me find someone of appropriate grade." Up to this point, we know the story's true. But according to legend at least, the person that he found of appropriate grade was a scullery boy. It was a young man of the age of 13 whose job it was to dig latrines for the American Army. And if this is true, this means that Cornwallis's lieutenant surrendered to a plumber for all practical sake. I find some great irony to that the greatest army in the world surrenders to a guy that was digging toilets a few minutes earlier. I'd like to think it's true. I'm not really sure there at the end. All right. So the war is won. Yorktown was the last major battle. We haven't signed the Peace of Paris yet, but the war is over. Washington has held his army together. He's only won one great battle. Yorktown was it. The rest of them, he held his army together. But Yorktown, he just destroyed them, and we have won the war. But now that the fighting is over, we're going to have our greatest test. And to me, Washington shows his true greatness off the battlefield. The Continental Army had not paid our soldiers. Under the Articles of Confederation, it required unanimous decision to do anything. All 13 states had to agree. And if you know anything about history of this time period, you know that you're never going to get all 13 states. If you get 12, you're not going to get Rhode Island. Rhode Island is not going to agree. But I've got a good friend of mine from Rhode Island. Their unofficial motto, they're proud of this. You can get this on license plates. It says, "Rhode Island, the traditional home of the otherwise minded." Okay? Rhode Island is the only state that to this day has voted against every major war conflict we've ever gone into. They've never voted for it. They were the last state to vote for the Declaration of Independence. They were the last state to vote for the Constitution. They're going to vote against it. So, when the time came to vote to pay the Continental soldiers, or to put a 5% tax to pay them, Rhode Island wouldn't vote for it. So the officers got together at a place called Newburgh. We call this the Newburgh Conspiracy. And they secretly start plotting against their own government. These officers feel like they gave their blood for this country. They deserved to be paid, and they did deserve to be paid. They felt like Congress was not doing what they were supposed to do. And these are educated men, historians in some cases. They knew what you're supposed to do next. What happens after every revolution? The army rises up. So their plan, and Alexander Hamilton was part of it, unfortunately. I love Hamilton, but this was a big problem for him. Their plan was, we'll march on the capital. The capital wasn't in Washington, it was in Philadelphia still. We're going to march on the capital. We're going to take the capital, and if they don't pay us, we're going to make George Washington King of the United States. Washington finds out about this. This is all done in secret. And Washington shows up at the cabal, at the meeting. No announcement. I can just see it now. The doors kick open and here comes Washington. This would be terrifying, guys, because Washington is a giant. I don't know if y'all can imagine George Washington in your mind. Think John Wayne, okay? It was once said, they asked John Adams one time, why is Washington chosen to lead everything? And John Adams said, because he's the tallest man in the room. Washington shoves this door open and he comes in with his cadre of men. And these guys are plotting. And silence happens. Washington steps up to the front of the room, to the podium. And he stands there for just a second. And he does something that no one had ever seen before. He reached in his pocket and he pulled out his glasses. And he put them on. Now, it's hard for us to imagine this, but in this time period, wearing glasses was seen as a major weakness. It wasn't just a physical problem. There was something wrong with you. It was a questioning of your masculinity. Washington took his glasses out and put them on. His men had never seen him with them. And Washington says, and I'm almost in tears just thinking about it, but he looks out at his men and he says, forgive me, men, but I have grown not only gray, but old and nearly blind in service to my country. And then he begins to lecture his men about duty. And he says, we did not fight this war to create another kingdom. We fought this war for freedom. We fought this war for democracy. And if you want to overthrow the government and establish a military dictatorship, you've got to do it without me, because I'm leading troops on the other side. And that cabal broke down right there. And there was never mention again about making George Washington king. I don't know about you. I would have a hard time with that. Somebody said, Mike, we're gonna make you king. All right, good. I got a lot of things I'd like to get done. But Washington says, no, I'm not a king. I'm a president. Brings me to tears to think about this. Finally, the last thing I want to talk to you about Washington being a deist. When Washington swears his oath of office, when he finally becomes president, Congress has written an oath that you state, where you promise to protect the Constitution. There's an oath written there. But when Washington showed up, Washington is the one that shows up with a Bible. Constitution doesn't say you have to have a Bible. Washington brings a Bible, and he puts his hand on that. And at the end of his oath, he says 4 words that are not in the oath. So help me God. So help me God. And President Simpson have followed that. But the standard was set by George Washington. These are not the words of a deist. These are the words of a Christian man. These are the words of a man that believes that God speaks to each one of us. And he believed that God was calling him to a duty. So George Washington was not just a man of duty, but he was a man of destiny. Thank you all for listening.